This is Pink Talks, the place where we discuss intersectionality and human rights.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Pink Talks, and specifically our series on sex education. This series is which we are exploring questions on how sex education can be inclusive, of high quality, and serve its purpose in informing people and how to make good choices about their sexual activities, relationships, and their sexual health. Also, we're discussing what may be going wrong with sex education and that most people receive today, if they receive any at all. So in today's talk, we'll be discussing sex education and disabilities. So my name is Leah, and I go by she, her pronouns. And a little physical description of me: I have brown, blondish, curly hair. I have blue eyes with glasses on. I'm wearing an orange tank top and some tattoos. Yeah. And I'm also joined today with my co-host, Femke.
Yes, hello everyone. A pleasure to be here. And as Leah mentioned, my name is Femke, and I'm also using she, her pronouns. My physical appearance is I have my hair up in a bun, is like light, dark blonde, I would say, brown eyes. I'm white. I am wearing a blue shirt, and I have like a little piercing in my nose, and I think that's it. And yeah, I'm really, really happy to be the co-host of today. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce to you today our today's speaker, Amber DiPetra. Amber DiPetra is a poet, a performance artist, body worker, and organizer for disability and sex worker rights. Her book, Waveforms, with collaborator Denise Lito, came out from Kenning Editions in 2011. Her one-woman show, The Opposite of Evolution Dance Studio, premiered at the Tampa International Fringe Festival in 2018. And other writings appear in anthologies like Beauty is a Verb, The New Poetics of Disability, and Poetry and Work. She's a co-founder of two social justice collectives, the Tampa Bay Area chapter of Sex Workers Outreach Project and the Disability and Sexuality Access Network, or Pleasurable. If you want to find out more about her work, you can find her at The Body Poetic on all social media platforms. And to find out more about the Disability and Sexuality Collective she is part of, you can go to Linktree and search Get Pleasurable. Amber, warm welcome for you today. Would you like to add anything?
No, thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. I can just give a little image description of myself. I'm shoulder length, dark brown hair. I'm white. I'm wearing big glasses with dark frames and red lipstick. And let's see. I'm in my apartment, which is also my studio. So you might be able to see like the bright colored walls by far in the back there. And I don't know if I said my pronouns are she, her as well.
All right. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. Of course, me and Leah, we have sort of our own history about why we're, why sex education became such a huge topic of interest for us. And I think for both of us, honestly, like the interest stems mostly from actually a lack of comprehensive sex education, like if we received anything at all, actually. And we were also wondering, like, how did you get first started in sex education, and why are you passionate about the topic?
Yeah, so I only recently, in the last 10 years, received an official certification in alternative sex education. But since I was a child, I was very interested in sex and sexuality. And because I was a disabled child with multiple physical disabilities, I could tell very early on that made it hard for me. It would make it hard. There were barriers, there were stigma and oppression to me as a disabled person having a sexuality. And that became part of my art and writing and activism. And then about 10 years ago, I did become certified as a somatic sex educator.
Nice. So it's very interesting. Could you tell us a little bit more about how you got into your current career path as a certified sexology body worker? And also then what inspired you to co-found Pleasure?
Yeah, so I completely started in a very different place than sex education. I was getting my graduate degree in creative writing, and I had recently moved to San Francisco, California, from my home in Florida. So way across the United States, and it was really sort of, a different country. San Francisco is a different country than Florida. And so I had a really powerful realization about what it means to identify as disabled, and started to learn things about not just what that identity group meant in the present day, but disability rights and disability justice. And I got involved working in many different non-governmental organizations, local and national nonprofits, doing disability advocacy, and really working as a peer counselor for other folks with disabilities. And then it wasn't until I sort of, after 10 years of doing that, got very burned out from all the dysfunctions of the system that make it so hard to get anything done, where I sort of revisited my passion for the topic of sexuality and beliefs I had around sexuality and healing. And so that's what led me into sex education, or specifically alternative sex education, like somatic sex education. But in the work that I do now as a sexological body worker and sex educator, a lot of it is life coaching. I'm not a fan of the word life coaching, but life coaching skills that I learned working with marginalized peer communities when I was officially employed as a disability activist.
All right, thank you. And could you maybe, because we looked a bit through the website of your project, Pleasurable, or the organization, and it is really interesting. And we were wondering if you could maybe give us a bit more detail, like what is Pleasurable, like what are the projects that Pleasurable is currently engaged in, and also what are you trying to achieve with it for the disabled community?
So my co-founder and I, Kaz, we go by Kaz Killjoy, and other names in the States, we met at a sexuality conference in 2016 in Washington, D.C. It was a big deal. It's a very renowned, respected sexuality conference that's been happening for maybe nearly 100 years. But there at the conference, we didn't find ourselves represented as folks with disabilities, and we had a lot of issues there. And we knew that this was also a problem for folks of color attending the conference. But what had just come out at that point was what we say WACSHN, the Women of Color Sexual Health Network, is how I've heard the acronym pronounced. And so just as it's women of color, BIPOC women, working together to help uplift each other as sex educators of color, but also to go into spaces that need more education, more consulting. So Kaz and I were like, well, we need something like that, like a disability and sexuality network that puts us together as sex educators and disabled people to have a stronger presence online, and actually a directory of disabled sex educators, and that tackle, questions from the press, going to conferences, doing weekly or monthly classes. So we've been working to that end since 2016. Not easy, being mostly disabled and doing our own work that earns money, and then trying to create a volunteer-run collective such as Pleasurable. So it has taken us a long time to unfold. Currently, getting the website built, getting the grant, all these things took so much time and stops and starts for Kaz and I with our medical issues. And then only in the last several months have we gathered a great team of other folks who want to work collectively, other disabled sex educators. And when I say disabled sex educator, you can be a person with a disability who is interested in sexuality and using that to write a novel, or our definition of what a sex educator is very broad. So now that we have more of a team in place for a larger collective, we really hope to add many more resources to our website, including, a list of books to read around disability and sexuality, to better health practices with what to expect when you're disabled and going to the gynecologist. Also, we want to have like monthly classes. So we're working around all of the parts of that right now. Largely a barrier is that for these monthly classes that we would like to have online, that would be free to folks with disabilities. It's quite expensive to pay for ASL and captioning, and that is an absolute must as a disability collective, that we have to provide that with every class, and quite expensive, up to $1,000 per class. So we're trying to do some fundraising and still, building up to what we can be. And we're always looking for new folks to join. So, yeah.
I really like what you said about a sex educator can really kind of be anyone. And I think with education, we usually think of such formal ways, but these informal and even storytelling is so, it hits much deeper, I feel, and sticks with people longer. Just, maybe attending a class with a teacher in a traditional sense. So that's great.
Yeah, yes. And also, to a certain degree, to formalizing your career can have lots of barriers for disabled folks. And so we don't want to use that to cut folks out of what they can be as peer sex educators.
So how do you perceive the current state of sex education for people with disabilities? What do you think, how would you describe it right now as it is?
So it's largely what's true for disabled folks is true for the United States in general, and the issues that we have around sex education. Even though a large percentage, like into the 90s, of parents agree that they want their kids to receive sex education, the reality is that there's a wide array of ways that these classes can be delivered. The consistency, the frequency, the overall quality is monitored by different. It's monitored by local school districts and the kind of demographics and political issues that they harbor. And so even though there's some basic standards for sex education, you'll find in a lot of areas where it's more religious that they're going to be teaching the abstinence only model. Or, sometimes you have the abstinence only model plus where that includes, sex education is that we don't have sex until we get married. But if, you really need to be safe, here are a couple things, a couple of methods of, STI prevention items. So, and really when we talk about comprehensive sex education, which is a curriculum that goes beyond abstinence only, it goes beyond even just barriers and STIs and beyond anatomy, and talks more about consent and healthy relationships and all these things. Even in those best case scenarios with comprehensive sex education, it seems like only 3 states really fulfill that out of the 50, those being California, New Jersey, and Oregon. And in the other states, it's very hit or miss. So that's just the general view of it. But so for folks with disabilities, what we found, what I experienced personally going to school, and then also what is still happening, is that in the places where sex education is delivered, it might only be delivered in a health or a PE, physical education class, on the 3rd Thursday of every month. And a lot of disabled kids in school don't go through a health or PE class because, well, it is a mandate to make those classes accessible for students with disabilities. That doesn't happen either. And so disabled students don't go to these classes, or they don't go frequently enough that they miss the one time a month maybe this class is offered on. And then there's all sorts of, US being a very Puritan country in some ways, ideas of what it means for people with developmental or intellectual disabilities to be engaged in sex education. Lots of arguments to that extent. And then we know that I could go on, but.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you already mentioned it also that before that there's a lot of dysfunction in the system, and also when you were talking about how the idea of pleasurable developed, you mentioned that there is like barely or no representation at all, and I think most of us know now like how much representation matters, right? And we were also wondering, like in that sense, like how is sex education, if with all the obstacles that you already mentioned, like how is it also, like if it is taught, like how is it taught through like a very ableist lens, and so really like lacking for people with disabilities? So maybe can you like go into that a bit more deeper?
Yes, well, the biggest thing I do with working with disabled clients around sexuality is to broaden their definition of what sex is, what it includes. Because in our culture, we shrink down that definition to just a few things. And then certainly, if we're just doing a sex education format that is dealing with barrier methods for STI prevention, or even just basic anatomy, then we're looking at sex as penis and vagina penetration, right? And so when you define sex that narrowly, you leave a lot of folks with different kinds of bodies out, not to mention LGBTQ folks.
Yeah. So this might be a very question, or very open, but why do you think it's so difficult for people to talk about disabilities and sexuality?
Yeah, I mean, historically, we have had a way of collapsing disability with being childlike, not being able to consent, and so or of folks with disabilities lacking sexuality, and just a lot of old beliefs still persist around disability. I mean, the disability rights movement has been called the forgotten civil rights movement in the U.S. So there are so many old tropes that prevent us from even getting our minds around how and why disabled people are sexual beings, and how that is a part of human rights. A lot of conceptual barriers to getting that across to folks. I mean, when folks ask what I do and I say work around disability and sexuality, it's often they just they don't know what to say. They have to just process the phrase as it is. Yeah.
And what do you think can we as society or as activists do to counteract that stigma? And maybe also, and the second question, like in an ideal world for you, how would sex education for disabled people look like, or how should it be?
Yeah. Well, in an ideal world, we would have the Americans with Disabilities Act would actually be an enforceable series of laws. So a lot would be different for disabled folks. I think that things are starting to improve because of where millennials are at and where Gen Z is at about body image, body neutrality, not just body love or body positivity, because we know those are problematic, but I love these phrases like body acceptance or body neutrality. Also, even phrases like desire politics. And I'm 43. We did not have that phrase, I think, until I was, maybe only 10 years ago. And these phrases and these terms are starting to turn the way people look at what is beautiful, what is sexy, what is intimacy, and open up, new nuances that we've never been able to work with before. So ideally, I would love to have a fully accessible public school for people with disabilities, and also have people with disabilities really integrated into not just sex education, but every facet of the school, so that it so that they would be fully integrated. Because in reality, sex education as it exists now in the United States is just not a hospitable place in most schools for people with disabilities.
I think you said that earlier too. I have to be honest, I didn't think about the fact that in American schools, usually it's taught in health classes or physical education classes. And that was the case for me. I grew up in Maryland. So, and it was the same thing, like abstinence and very like heteronormative, able-bodied sex education. So I think, that was my privilege of, oh, well, I just go to health class and this is boring and I have to take this class. But, some people really miss out on these topics or educations that are really important in just life in general. So.
Yeah, for sure. And I think what I was also trying to say earlier is that the kind of shifts in culture we need are fearlessness of allowing disabled people to come into the conversation, and by allow I mean making accommodations, but also by employing or hiring disabled actors to play disabled characters, and those characters having powerful sexual identities or an intimate storyline. So it's conversations that happen in the media too hugely affect how we can then be able to see how folks with disabilities really are sexual people and deserve a sex education.
Yeah, I know. I binge watched Sex Education, the show on it, and season they had a person in a wheelchair, and it was a good step in the right direction, but there definitely needs to be more.
Yeah, these shows, Sex Education, Atypical, Speechless, and there was one other one that I know have recently all folded their disabled characters into some kind of sexual situation, or a plot around intimacy, a plot line. And that's really amazing, because a few years ago, we didn't even have 4 shows you could list. This is the first time, I would say, in history that there's been 4 television shows that you could list that in, or even 4, yeah, and the movies aren't much better. So.
Yeah. I do agree, though, with like the newer generation coming and having social media, which I love, TikTok specifically, but I see a lot of representation on those, but also I think it's really important that it comes from the person themselves, and not someone talking about their story, but it's like a real experience, and it's a great way too for other people to see and be involved, and also like maybe have an opportunity to ask questions in that sense of like the comments. Yeah, I hope things are changing, but yeah, I think.
Well, I think that is a good point, because we don't just watch television shows or movies anymore. We watch each other as influencers on social media platforms, and because that has really, in some ways, or originally been democratized, it allows people with disabilities to step up onto a level playing field as as the internet is for some folks with disabilities and continues to be quite strewn with barriers for some other kinds of disability. But yeah, so influencer culture as entertainment has really made an important space for disabled folks.
How can able-bodied people make sure that there's space for people with disabilities in discussion of sexuality? Like, what would you suggest that we could do?
Yeah, I think that first and foremost is to include where, just constantly include. There's no scenario for in which disabled folks need to be kept out of any kind of sex education. So anywhere that's in discussion, conferences, among your peers, to always be reminding of folks of that identity group that gets left out often. And don't let things like ability to make accommodations stop you. Like, there's ways to apply for grants for accommodations. And also, if you're an organization that lacks the funds to, say, have a sign language interpreter, then there are other ways you can approach that if you absolutely have to. And that's totally, especially if you're an organization that is not primarily serving those with disabilities, but as another organization, if you're very transparent to folks about what you are able to accommodate because of the budget you have, and invite people to write in asking other ways that they could be accommodated in these spaces, then that's as good a place as any to start, in lack of a huge budget to make all of these more costly accommodations for people to be present and in the room.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a very important point, and also something that I feel like in the it's not really so common. I feel like like where I worked before, or also in university, I feel like accessibility and accommodation is still quite rare, unfortunately. Thank you so much, Amber and Leah. I think we're already at the end of our conversation. Again, Amber, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to speak to you, and for all your really amazing and super important insights, and for sharing your time for this event. And thanks, Leah, for co-hosting with me today, and thank you to our listeners and viewers. Everyone, take care and see you next episode. I don't know if you want to say goodbye also, or add something, Amber or Leah.
No, just thank you for having me. And please, anyone who would like to be in touch with me, I welcome that.
Yeah, and also because you mentioned that you're doing fundraising for your for your project, for your organization, Pleasurable for Everyone. Check it out and maybe leave some funds also. Thank you so much, and take care, everyone. See you.
Thank you.
Stay tuned for next week, where we'll discuss sex education in schools. Thank you for listening to Pink Talks. Before we go, show some love for our favorite podcast by leaving us a comment and subscribe to the channel. We are Young Educators, a non-profit organization working on human rights, gender equality, and active citizenship. And this podcast was created with the support of our team.
Leah Cheney,
Emke Becherer,
Ana Catarina Caldeira,
Laura Staffie,